Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Diego Báez.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to chat and talk all about your writing. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a poet and a critic, a book critic. So I write a lot of poetry and read and review a lot of books. I learned in grad school, I learned from a mentor and professor then, Rigoberto Gonzalez, the importance of reading as much as you write, and even sometimes reading more than you write. And I have found it so useful to read a lot of, especially contemporary poetry, that then it kind of informs my own thinking. And I hope, and I mean, I believe that reading more poetry helps me think critically about my own. And I think a challenge has been balancing both of those, right? And feeling like there's so much good stuff to read, and I want to elevate the voices that I think need to be elevated, especially from like small presses or underrepresented folks and underrepresented voices. But then also having to kind of force myself to allot enough time to my own creative output, my own creative endeavors in terms of actually writing my own poems. And so it's like a
Mhm.
challenge, but it's a great challenge to have, to feel like I'm kind of compelled to balance both of those.
Absolutely. Can you share some poets or specifically contemporary poets that you're interested in reading?
Yes, I can. So actually, there's two poets who are in the top of my mind. I was thinking about this ahead of our call today. One is a poet named Tracy Fouad, and she has a book coming out next year in February called Portal. And I had the pleasure of reading it and reviewing it for Book List, and it's super interesting the way Fouad uses the internet as sort of like a mirror,
Mhm.
and especially algorithms that tend to anticipate our desires. And it can sometimes feel like the computers know more about us than we do about ourselves, or they can kind of tell us exactly what they think it thinks we should want. But she also always keeps it so anchored in the human, that balancing that seems really tricky, and she does it really well. There's another poet, India Lena Gonzalez. She had a book come out, I think it was in 2023. I think it was maybe September, October, maybe earlier than that. But it's called Fox Woman Get Out. And
Oh,
it's a great title, a great collection. It's got this just audacious use of energy, on like a line level and even on a poem by poem level that I would recommend everybody check out, because those are both two phenomenal poets doing really good work.
fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I would love to shift the conversation more towards your writing now. Can you tell me a bit about the type of poetry that you write?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that I didn't have until, let me put it this way, until I discovered formal poetry, which happened, in my education, every now and then reading sonnets or what have you, triolets, etc. It wasn't until grad school that I took a workshop with Rachel Hadas, and she required, I won't say forced, she required us to try out all kinds of different forms that I had never really had the pleasure of encountering. I remember encountering Huzzles there, and that being really just interesting in terms of what you can do when you give yourself a few little constraints with sort of what the ends of the lines need to be doing. And then also, I mean, it was a failed attempt, but I learned a lot about myself and my own writing. Professor Hadas had us write ballads, and I wasn't good at it, and mine didn't turn out well. But I learned a lot about what one can do when forced into the box, the kind of the container of a form. Because then, once you learn the forms, you can learn to break out of them and do new and interesting things. And I'm tempted here to keep talking about other poets who do fun things with form, but for myself, I think that I try to explore that in between space, maybe like a hybrid space between strict form and more free verse or even prose poems. And in the book, I wouldn't say I try to blend them together, but there's a good mix of both, um, which uh, which I hope makes sense in the shape of the book. The prose poems in Yaguareté White, they predominate in the opening pages as sort of a way to like set the tone before they start to kind of break apart. And then I have tried to introduce lots of different types of forms and shapes for the poems as sort of the purview of the book kind of expands. And so, and I think that's probably true for me now and will be true for a long time, is kind of playing with the space in between form and kind of free verse.
That is so cool. Yeah, I especially love what you were mentioning there too about how many interesting things can come out of constraints like that. And I
Hmm.
think when people think of poetry, they either think of it very rigidly or that it's completely free and there are no rules. And it's, in my opinion, poetry is the most interesting when you're in that space in between and really leaning into that.
Yeah, yeah, and oftentimes when we even when we feel like or think there aren't any rules at play, I think if we dig a little bit deeper, there are sometimes these hidden structures. I'm really big into syllabics, just counting the number of syllables and where the stresses are. And
Mhm.
I can't rattle off the list of all the technical names for each different grouping, but there's like this hidden language of it's like a secret math behind the syllabics that kind of produce the kinds of rhythms and surprises and maybe things we didn't expect, even if it's not clearly like a sonnet or what have you.
And it's also interesting when you get into things like the syllables and everything, how so much of that is intuitive.
Hmm.
And you didn't, at least I found that I didn't necessarily think that I was trying to make a rhyme scheme
Hmm.
or trying to do meter. And then once I learned that, I went, oh, I was so close to doing it consciously. I just had
Yeah,
to change a few things to actually make it fit the form.
yeah. Sometimes you can't help it.
For sure. Do you have a favorite style of poem? You mentioned ballads are not the favorite, but do you have it?
Yeah, yes. I love a good short poem. I love the challenge, I guess for myself as a writer, but also as a reader, to see what poets can do in like 8 lines or 4 lines or even 2 lines is I just find that so rewarding because it looks easy on the page. Like, oh, there's only like 12 words in this poem, but they're all the right words, all the right syllables, all the right beats and spaces and everything. I remember one by Peter Glovinsky, I think. I can double check the name, but he had a poem called Her Grin. That was the title of the poem, it was just Her Grin. But then way down the bottom of the page, kind of like 3/4 of the way down the page, was just another 3 words, is a rope. And there's so much room for interpretation there. And it's so simple and straight. It seems straightforward, like it's just 5 words in the whole title and poem, but there's so much space to kind of project our own interpretations onto that.
Oh,
But I
I
love a
love
good
that.
short poem like that. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So you're creating the poem yourself
Mhm.
while you read it.
Mhm.
That's so cool. What are some motifs or phrases
Hmm.
or rules that you stick to in your poetry?
Yeah. So it's funny because the book kind of came together over the course of what I would consider a very long time, like 10, 12, almost pushing 15 years, not quite, closer to 12. But it's been interesting then to see so how the poems kind of gel together or develop once they were mostly in place, how they then developed together. And I have done some accounting, like I've gone through and kind of searched for certain words and terms and kind of rereading the manuscript and realizing that color is a recurring theme for sure. There's lots of like red and white and brown and blue that pop up in different ways and for different reasons. And I was conscious of that for most of the book's composition, wanting to be intentional about the use of color. Um,
Mhm.
and the other, I mean, one thing that is certainly distinctive, I think, about the book is the use of Guaraní, which is an indigenous language that is one of two sort of national languages of Paraguay. And I mean, that's central to the book for sure. My father's from Paraguay. I've spent some time there every 3 or 4 years. We've been able to go back as a family, less frequently now. But the indigenous language Guarani is fascinating to listen to. I don't know a whole lot of it myself. I can sort of read it with a lot of practice. I've had some help, some instruction from family and from my dad. But it is such a central component to life in Paraguay, as well as then like my memories of that, right? And so like culturally, nationally, but also with regard to my family is very important. And so I knew I had to make it into my poems as well as
Mhm.
the book itself. One of the struggles of the book is trying to confront the fact that like this is a language that my family speaks. I did not learn it growing up. I'm trying to learn enough of it to pass on to my child. And sort of towing the line or walking a fine line between, what is mine to share and tell, and where's the line between, I guess, appreciation or appropriation, or just being careful with the kinds of stories and the kinds of language that I have access to. To my knowledge, there hasn't been many or any Paraguayan American poets, and so it's a privilege to bring this language to, publication in the States. That feels like a big deal.
It's
I also
incredible.
anticipate that it'll
Yeah.
be frustrating for some readers because as much as the speakers of the poems struggle with this language that they sort of understand but don't really have a grasp on, so do the reader. And so that relationship, I hope builds and grows over the course of the book.
I love that. So that story and that connection is very personal, but
Mm.
how do you balance that in your poetry? Do you tend to lean more towards the personal or the fantastical in your writing?
That's a great question. Because so much of my family, factually, but also exaggerated, are in the book. I've been thinking a lot about lies in poetry and the liberty, like giving ourselves as poets, giving ourselves the liberty to lie, and where that line is between, am I misrepresenting something that, again, lays claim to something that is not my own, or would upset, the inspiration or the actual person who maybe participated in whatever events that made it into the poem. And it's interesting because so many of the poems, especially, there's a couple speakers in the book. Some of them are pretty close to my own experiences and my own opinions, but some of them are very distant. The ones that feel closest to me are, even if in the final result the poem is spoken in the first person singular, a lot of the more intimate family moments. There's a couple poems about playing with my cousins, my premates as a kid, about navigating those like meals and travel through Paraguay with my family. In my mind, it's a first person plural perspective. So I have two younger brothers, Armando and Miguel, and we did all this stuff together. And they're the only two people on the planet who have experienced, if not exactly the same, very, very close to the same things that I have in these journeys. And so even if then the end result, the poem, it has been sort of shapen into this first person singular, they are both very much present in the imagining of those poetic worlds. And
Mhm.
so I think for this book, I mean, you cannot separate sort of the real experiences of my family. And I've also, though they've all read it, so my whole family member, all of them have read the book, and they've had some interesting feedback about things that were either exaggerated or invented or like combined. Like something will happen to kind of one person and they kind of switch it up as the speaker. But so far, we're still a pretty healthy family unit, no major fallouts. We'll see. We'll see what happens once the book is actually out.
I love that talking about like the lying in poetry because it's so much of the heart of the genre. And people kind of get offended at that idea. But we also have the whole like, thing of poetic license.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of times, as long as the feelings are real, it's okay if the actions are made up.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I totally agree.
And that's when your families can still be healthy families after they read your poetry, but
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
So you're also a teacher and a book critic. How do these things impact your writing, if at all?
Yeah, for sure. So teaching, definitely. I'm lucky to work with students at the city colleges of Chicago and who come from dozens of countries all over the world. They speak dozens of languages. They've had these lives and experiences and perspectives that are so enormous and brave. And I learned so much from them about balance, about what's really important, and about flexibility, just in terms of their lives and experiences have not necessarily prepared them for the rigidity of higher education in the US. And I feel a real calling to answer that and to say, well, it can be a place for you. Let's make it a place for you, even if it's starting just in the space of our own classroom, that can extend out. And I don't know that that happens or can even happen at many institutions of higher education. And so being part of that possibility, I mean, the possibility for that kind of transformation it's really motivating. It provides sustenance to me. It also when if I'm doing a poetry class, it's also helps to demystify the process of writing and relieve some of that self-imposed pressure to produce and to publish, because in the context of a classroom with a bunch of teachers and learners together, it just changes sort of what's at stake. It heightens it in some ways, but it also it's like a sigh of relief, like a breath of fresh air as well, to kind of get out of the poetry world can be super celebratory and really supportive. It can also be competitive and cutthroat in different ways. And so to be able to have a role that is a little bit outside that, it's definitely how I survive the business of writing.
I completely get that. Yeah. So, how did you get into poetry?
Mhm. I think my first two influences, and perhaps it happened earlier, but for sure in seventh grade, Bloomington, Illinois, I remember two two very important encounters. One was with Edgar Allan Poe, and the way that Poe architected these rhyme schemes across his lines and across his verses blew my mind, because it was like you can put the same rhyme at the end and also in the middle, and then you can echo it between in different places. It was so and then for it all to make narrative sense blew my mind, blew my, I guess, 12-year-old mind. That was incredible. And at that time I wanted to start writing poems like that, and I did. And my high school poems were all like so much rhyme. It was very heavy handed, but I had to kind of work through that. The other influence that I can't really separate from that's that same year in like seventh grade. I'm dating myself here, but Eminem's first album came out, and I probably shouldn't have been listening to that as a 12 or 13-year-old. And it's wildly problematic for multiple reasons. But I will say that the creativity and the storytelling and the wordplay, especially, really appealed to me. Um, if I, yeah, if my child gets into rap and hip hop, I will probably start her on the sort of edited, the radio edit versions first, and then she can kind of graduate to more extreme stuff. But uh, so there are some poems in the book rather that adopt a little bit of a hip hop sort of rhyme or rhythm. I would say that those speakers are probably a little more heightened with bravado. Those are still very
Mhm.
close to me, but they're a little bit of a like a persona that has been that I've kind of created. Um, and so for sure, those two, it's funny to have those two as my anchors, but I go back to them a lot. I think about them a lot.
Those are fascinating for two influences. I don't think you would usually think to pair those together, but I it makes me want to read your poetry even more than I already did, which is saying something. Because I oh my gosh, that all sounds amazing. And I think that's a very very cool pairing. So I'm curious what your actual writing looks like. Are you the
Mhm.
kind of person that needs to set time for yourself specifically to write? Does it just sort of happen when you're out and about? What does it look like?
For sure. I've got a list of criteria, preferred criteria, and then I have a really important caveat. So if I'm imagining like an ideal writing time, I got coffee or tea, got lots of light, lots of natural light. I prefer a big space that is open and maybe there are people bustling about. I remember several years ago, my wife had a job in Detroit at the Renaissance Center there. It's this enormous structure. It's got all kinds of stuff in it. And that's where GM does a lot of their business. And so I tagged along because I had never been to Detroit. And I had essentially this enormous atrium. At the time, there was a coffee shop there. I had this enormous atrium all to myself to just sit and write. And that was really ideal. Um, the caveat is that I know and I work to be more flexible about that and to try to be a little less precious about, and I don't mean that condescendingly, but like to imagine there's going to be a perfect time and place to do writing is a
Mm.
habit that I've had to really get away from, especially with, a job and a family now and other obligations, etc. It I really have to just kind of face the fact that I'm not always going to have the atrium of the Renaissance Center with all kinds of natural light and coffee. Sometimes it's just my computer at a desk
Mhm.
in a room after hours. And what I've developed I think most writers do. They develop tricks and hacks to try to make themselves as productive as possible. One way I've done this is to either set a word count, like try to get 1,000 words, no matter what it may be, or a particular amount of time. Because what I usually find is if I can hit that, if I can hit 1,000 words, or if I can write for 20 or 30 minutes, I usually have momentum and I can kind of keep it going for a little bit longer. And then it's just a way of, I guess, reassuring myself that not everything has to be perfect for the writing to get done. And that in fact, I sometimes feel the same way about writing as I do about running. Like I don't
Mhm.
always look forward to it. I don't necessarily enjoy it all the time while I'm doing it, but after the fact, I very much enjoy having done it and I'm the better for it. So I try to try to trick myself into remembering that.
Yeah, I think it's a very important lesson that can take a long time to learn as a
Mm,
writer, for sure. That it's you really can't be too precious about
mm.
the times that you're writing. Though that definitely sounds like the ultimate dream, what you described there, with all the light and everything. Oh, it sounds perfect. So, when you're writing, do you find that you do it silently, or
Mm,
do you speak any of the lines aloud? Because I know for prose writing,
mm.
you're usually not narrating yourself like an audiobook, but poetry can be very different there.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the best pieces of advice, I wish I remember who said, probably multiple people said this over time, but was to read your work out loud because there's a very large debate, and I think it's very interesting about the poems on the page versus poems on the stage or being performed. But even if you're someone who prefers to kind of work with the space of the page primarily, I think we can still benefit from reading it out loud. I've caught I mean, this literally happened earlier this week where I've caught myself using the same exact word as one stands after another, not intentionally. So doing that
Mhm.
intentionally is one thing, but having it just come up because it's like a word you like to use, I don't know that I would have caught it had I not been reading it aloud. And so that's been helpful for sure. I will say when I'm composing or just writing or pre-writing or brainstorming or just messing around or whatever, I think I do I think I do enjoy the energy of other people. And so whether that's a sort of semi-busy public space or even like a coffee shop or whatnot, there's something about like the energy of other people that almost helps me feel accountable, but also just excited, like energized by other folks being in the space with me.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Okay, this is kind of a big question. So
Mm.
forgive me, but what is poetry? Just in general, writing it, reading it, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think that reading poems it helps me to imagine the world in new ways. um, to hear voices that are not my own, that may be similar to my experience, but especially those that are very far from it. It can help me reimagine, rethink what's possible.
Mm.
And if I can imagine the world in a new way, then perhaps I can imagine myself in a new way. Maybe then I can act to remake my way of life so that it is more aligned with the world, if that makes sense. It's not, I don't think, an easy thing to do. I'm not saying I'm always successful at it, but I really, really believe that one of the most important traits for just about anybody in the world today, more so like now, is that ability, that intellectual flexibility, the ability to kind of rethink who you are and to remake yourself, not just in the service of to oneself, but in service of everybody else. Because I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's all we've got.
Mhm. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you. Um, you know, honestly, that was all of the questions I had for you today. This was a really incredible interview. I had a fantastic time talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I just have one last thing, and that's what do you have coming up?
Yeah, well, the book comes out February 20th, Yaguareté White. If I can, I would implore your listeners to visit their local independent bookstore for my book, which would
Yes.
be great, but for literally anything they need.
We
Um,
support bookstores on here always. Everyone, please go.
yes, it makes such a difference. The experience, as well as like literally like for me as an author, but also for us as readers, and for sure the people who work there, and
Mhm.
yeah, there will be some events in the spring of 2024. I'll have a virtual launch of the book with some other poets. Tracy Fouad, actually, who I mentioned, will be there.
Oh,
And then
cool.
we'll have a party in Chicago on the Thursday, February 22nd. And so there'll be cookies and a harpist plus poetry. So
That is fantastic. Thank you again for coming on.
thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Diego Báez.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The
The end.
end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.